Thank you. And firstly, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this seminar series. I think that their organization of this seminar and this series is a timely project. It supports, hopefully, all those working in the field of loneliness. This series allows a renewed connection, in my opinion, between old and new research into the field, older and newer theories about loneliness. And at the end, supporting all those involved in trying to fight the negative outcomes of loneliness among younger and older adults. In thanking the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this seminar, I'm happy to address the current state of loneliness research knowledge, as well as to identify some gaps in the field, as requested. However, this is not an easy undertaking. Loneliness research is expanding, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. For example, in my EndNote files, I have 240 loneliness publications over the last 5 years. And there must be much more, so 15 years. So it was really an awful undertaking. So in trying to summarize the current state of knowledge, one might start to investigate these recent publications. Which themes are most frequently addressed? Okay, a very brief survey showed that about 40% of the recent publications addressed the association between social network and loneliness. So more specifically, the way that social networks, social support, social isolation, social exclusion, living alone, family relationships and all that kind of factors can affect the intensity of loneliness. About 20% investigated the association between physical health and loneliness, including vulnerability, but also independent living versus institutional care. Another 20% addressed the association between psychological functioning or psychiatric disorders and loneliness, among which several new publications about depression and loneliness. 10% of these studies addressed loneliness, social isolation, and the risks of mortality. That's on the borderline of epidemiology, but it's still important for us. I come to that later. And 10% encompassed a variety of themes: poverty, migration, international migration, ethnic groups, rural-urban differences in loneliness, etc. The review also led me to some additional observations. Nowadays we see much more longitudinal research into loneliness, much more international comparative research into loneliness, and we see that loneliness research no longer stems exclusively from the United States, Canada, Western and Northern Europe. But increasingly, loneliness is of importance for and investigated in Central and Eastern Europe, Asia, and nowadays even in Africa. Publications on my list addressed China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, India, Singapore, and so forth. This week, a request for a translation of the scale into Urdu came in. So it's much broader than it used to be. Of course, providing a reliable general overview of current research is a mission impossible. That's why in addressing the developments and trends in loneliness research, I selected 3 fields. So after some introductory words that will follow soon, I try to show you something about research on personal support systems and loneliness. Secondly, research on social isolation and loneliness in a longitudinal or panel context. And thirdly, these country-level differences in loneliness. I'm particularly interested to tell you something about the individual level and societal level factors, determinants of loneliness. Before addressing these three fields of loneliness, I would like to clarify my point of view regarding the phenomena of loneliness and social isolation. This is all the more advisable given that nowadays new and diverging ideas about these central characteristics of our field are emerging. Having considered all these new ideas, I must confess that I'm not yet convinced that we need different theoretical concepts of loneliness and social isolation than the ones we already have been using for more than 3 decades. Social isolation, that concerns the objective characteristics of a situation and refers to a reduced network of kin and non-kin relationships. There is a continuum running at the one hand side from social isolation to social participation at the other one. It's not quite correct anymore on the slide, but you can understand the word participation needs to be at the end of the first line. Persons with a very small number of ties with others are by definition socially isolated. Examples of social isolation are Tom, a student in his first year at university, living on a campus far away from his family and former school friends, and Paul, a 70-year-old painter who after many years living and working in New York, moved to a cottage near the seacoast and became cut off by his remote environment. Loneliness is one end of a second continuum. Feeling well embedded or belongingness is at the other hand. Thanks to the efforts of Peplau and Perlman, dating back to 1980 and 1982, the conceptualization of loneliness as a theoretical construct became standardized, relying on similar terminology and definitions. Their definition. Loneliness is a situation subjectively experienced by an individual where there is an unpleasant or inadmissible lack of relationships or lack of quality of relationships. So this includes situations in which the number of existing relationships is smaller than is considered desirable, as well as situations where the quality or intimacy of the relationships realized is not fitting the desires one has for quality. Okay, research has shown that socially isolated persons run a greater risk of becoming lonely. Statistically seen, people who have a small social network are at risk of loneliness. On the other hand, those surrounded by a social network of meaningful personal relationships, objective, this situation is crucial for feeling socially embedded. Statistically seen, there is a close relationship, and I can inform you later if you want by showing you the graphs about the strong interrelationship between the two. But of course, there is a variation between people. We are talking about statistical relationship, but there are of course people, and I come to that later. Tom, for example, the student, he has a few number of friends in the new university environment. He feels lonely. But the painter Paul, who has few ties over there at the seacoast, he doesn't feel lonely because he is in a situation that he desired. But in general, there is a strong correlation between a small network and loneliness. Most researchers in the field use the cognitive discrepancy approach, also developed by Peplau and Perlman. The discrepancy subjectively experienced between the desire for personal relationships and the actually realized relationships, so feelings of missing a certain number of personal relationships, or feelings of missing a certain quality in one's relationships, is of crucial importance for the onset and continuation of loneliness. In this context, Russell and colleagues in 2012 showed that students who reported having fewer close relationships, close friendships than they desired, they were most likely to be lonely. Investigations guided by this loneliness theoretical model of cognitive discrepancy are optimally equipped to test the discrepancies between objective and subjective situation as far as a social network is concerned. And in this context, I mentioned two important studies. That's a 2008 study of Hawkley and colleagues based on US data, and the study by Burholt and Scharf, 2014, excellent examples of research demonstrating the interplay of different set of factors, determinants, affecting loneliness outcomes. Let's start to talk about recent research on the personal support system and loneliness. Many researchers in the field, as I mentioned some minutes ago, 40% at least of the recent publications, many researchers, historically and contemporarily, address this complex relationship between networks, characteristics of the networks, and loneliness. By far, most of all these researchers prove and continue to prove the strong association between these phenomena. That's the overall characteristic of these 40%. Most of them do prove that this is really existing. Recent research outcomes addressed as well-known precipitating factors, such as the support from adult children to their aging parents, but with new accents. For example, Takagi and Saito worked on co-residing families in Japan now that the situation in Japan is changing. I myself, together with colleagues, worked on co-residing in families in Eastern Europe. And what came out is that all these lovely ideas about children caring for their parents, that's not correct. It's the other way around. Very careful research showed that it's the older parent who takes care of the middle and the younger generation. So I think there is something new to be learned. But there are also very interesting, less frequently researched determinants of loneliness nowadays. An example is the role of friends meeting in pubs. Maybe also interesting for this country, but this research comes from Southern Europe. And it's interesting to see that Buss and colleagues and Sanchez and colleagues showed the strong relationship between meeting friends on a daily basis in pubs and the intensity of loneliness. Another new example is research by Rote and colleagues. I don't know the pronunciation, but I think Rote. It's about participation in religious institutions. An activity that still proves to integrate older adults into larger and more supportive social networks and protecting these older adults against loneliness in later life. We as researchers think that religious institutions are no longer that important, but this is a contra evidence. A few examples nowadays days include research on network characteristics of lesbian, gay and bisexual adults. Kuiper and Fokkema is an example, and I think this is a field of research that we have to keep in mind. New research on atypical groups of older adults. For example, research in China about those living alone in China. And normally they live together with in the family construction, but there are more and more people living alone. And how about alone in a situation for these people? Research by Chen and colleagues, 2014. The just mentioned studies encompass Northern and Western European countries, but as mentioned also Southern and Eastern regions, as well as New Zealand. There is an interesting research of Steffens and colleagues in New Zealand, including a large group of Maori people. The first time in history that they try to investigate the social network situation in these groups. So, and a lot of research in China and in India is coming up. So I think that's really interesting that we compare later on the situation in these other countries and the situation in Western Europe. Some personal comments about the methodological situation of the research. That's what the organizers asked me to think about some gaps. And I think methodologically we can put a step forward. In addressing social support and that kind of characteristics of the social networks of people, researchers sometimes use the ideas developed by Kahn and Antonucci already in 1980 about the circular structure of the convoy. You all know about that, with the focal relationships in the smallest inner circle. Others try to reconstruct the convoy by asking respondents about the relationships that are important to them, or asking them about persons they meet regularly. People who merely function in the peripheral or minor roles in relation to the respondent are in most research designs not taken into account. However, over the past 10 years, we learned a lot by listening to colleagues in a neighboring or partly overlapping discipline, and I refer to family sociologists. Around the year 2000, family sociologists started to pay attention not only to positive, that is, support exchanging relationships, but also focused on the not or not always supportive facets of subjects' relationships. Family sociologists started to investigate the interrelationships by focusing on various dimensions of solidarity, as advocated by Bengtson, Silverstein, Wenger, etc. And additionally on relationships that don't automatically continue to be relationships of solidarity. Lucier and Pillemer and Giarrusso and colleagues in 2005 already have advocated including this possibility of mixed feelings, ambivalence, both solidarity and conflict, as characteristics of relationships with members of the social convoy. Since then, survey research into personal relationships and loneliness started to address ambiguity and conflict a little bit as important aspects of network relationships more frequently than before. An example, for example, is a question in the anchor questionnaire of the Netherlands Kinship Panel Survey, asking about each of the members of the social network, and there is a question: have you had any conflicts, strains, or disagreement with this person, Peter, let's say, this person of your convoy in the last months? Lowenstein, investigating solidarity versus conflict and ambivalence, in this case of parent-child relationships, in a country comparative perspective of the OASIS study. And Krause and colleagues, 2008, showed, based on 2 United States survey researches, that significant inverse associations between a situation of negative social interactions and health and well-being. Notwithstanding this trend, I'm convinced that not supportive and conflictive type of relationships are significantly underreported in research into loneliness. Most loneliness researchers are not asking about persons with whom respondents are connected via a conflict bond. And here we might make a step forward. In this context, I like to tell you something about recent quantitative and especially qualitative research that have a lot to tell in this respect. Greater insight into loneliness was obtained when defective marriage relationships were explicitly considered in survey research. Conflict-ridden and emotionally unsupportive marriage relationships proved to be associated with much, much higher levels of loneliness. Research of Dijkstra and Fokkema, 2007. Another research, older adults who were confronted with adverse childhood events, such as being bullied, or being confronted with enduring conflicts between parents, report significantly higher levels of loneliness, even in old age. Research by Nicolaisen and Thorsen in 2013. But as to be expected, qualitative research is more clearly equipped to elicit information about conflictive personal relationship. An excellent example is the work by Koren in Israel, 2014-2013. She showed that especially after repartnering in later life, a non-negligible portion of the respondents mentioned emotional distance between partners as a consequence of experiencing disrespect from newly acquired family members. For example, adult stepchildren criticized the repartnering decision of their parents. They didn't accept the new partner or excluded their partner by discontinuing contact between this parent and the grandchildren. I also investigated stepchildren relationships in another context and the same came out. In doing so, the children showed that repartnering might be a replacement for couplehood, but not for parenthood. And the new older partners, confronted with these adverse behaviors, worked hard to overcome the emotional stress, but nevertheless spontaneously, in in-depth interviewing, mentioned increased levels of emotional loneliness. Qualitative research among older widowed adults in the Netherlands, by my colleague Mert and I myself, showed, in in-depth interviews, showed that about half of the interviewed widows were involved in sibling relationships characterized as ambiguous or even conflict-laden. Such non-optimal sibling bonds prove to be associated with discomfort and strong loneliness. I give you one example of one of my interviews. In this open interview, a widow explicitly connected her feelings of loneliness to a recent event involving her siblings. We, my sister and I, we were very close sisters. And then she had marriage problems. And during that time, I just had met Huub, her new intimate partner. And Huub said something about that husband. And that's why everything went wrong. My sister blamed Huub for this. And indirectly me too. And then we didn't see one another for a long period of time already. And she starts crying. The widow did not mention her sibling when we discussed her social network. Understandable. But yet, the unmentioned sibling proved to be central in this interviewee's onset of loneliness. So, broken off relationships are sometimes silently, but continuously influencing serious discomfort and loneliness. And I conclude this section with a plea. we need to rethink the investigation of the size, the composition and the functioning of personal networks with a more open eye for conflict relationships. Taboo topic, but it's very important for the onset of loneliness. I now come to the section 2, social isolation and loneliness in longitudinal surveys. Longitudinal, I mean panel surveys, so that the same persons are interviewed in wave 1 and wave 2, etc. Over the last 10 to 15 years, an exponentially increasing numbers of studies have explored loneliness from that longitudinal perspective, and that's very positive. The studies involved, I differentiated these according to the principal research questions, and I like to tell you something about the outcomes. Firstly, several studies investigated the hypothesis that over time, older adults are increasingly at risk of more intense loneliness. Yilha, 2004 already, studied the relationship between old age and loneliness using the Tampere longitudinal study in Finland. In the first wave, it was found that loneliness experienced either often or sometimes varied from 26% in the young old group to 55% in the oldest old group. In the longitudinal analysis, the general trend was for increasing loneliness within each of the age groups, and the proportion of people who reported loneliness increased as the sample grew older. 28 years after wave 1, Aertsen and Yilhe, 2011, concluded that about 1/3 of the older adults were lonely who hadn't been lonely in wave 1. So an increase of 30%, a remarkable increase. Parallel outcomes were shown in research by Dahlberg and colleagues, 2014. Between waves, older adults experienced varying levels of loneliness, but the general trend was increasing loneliness. Cohen-Mansfield and colleagues 2009 research in Israel showed an increase in mean levels of loneliness between each of the waves of the research in Israel. Dijkstra and colleagues investigated loneliness paths among a group of older adults using 4 waves of the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam. And as far as the general trend in loneliness over time was concerned, the results provided a clear picture. As time passes, older adults become lonelier, and the increase is highest for the oldest respondents. Notwithstanding the general lower levels of loneliness among those with a partner, as opposed to those who are single, over time, those living with a partner showed a stronger increase in loneliness than do those who remain single. This finding suggests that the partner relationship might not offer the same kind of protection against loneliness at advanced ages as it does earlier in the life course. The person who previously was a major source of support may have become the target of intensive caregiving. Anxiety over a partner's health, the loss of partner support, together with the demands of caregiving, may contribute to significant increases in loneliness. I cite Dijkstra. The protective effects of having a partner decline over time, and these are insights that could only be gained by using data from multiple waves. A second set of research questions used in panel research concerns the possibility of eliciting changes in loneliness over time and categorizing these changes in interpretable types. Victor and Bowling, 2012, differentiated UK respondents in 4 types. Those not lonely at each of the waves, 44% of the survey respondents. Those lonely at each of the waves, 22%. Those whose loneliness increased over the waves, 25%. And those whose loneliness decreased over the waves, 12%. Newell and colleagues, 2014, investigated also patterns of stability and change in loneliness over 5 years, and that was among Canadian older adults, and they elicited the same 4 types. A third group of research questions concerns the researchers investigating the causal relationships between several determinants of loneliness and the loneliness intensity. Of course, longitudinal research is optimal to investigate these causal relationships. And here a lot of research has to be named. Cacioppo did a lot of research again, with his colleagues in the US, starting in 2006, but they continue to do this. Houtjes and colleagues, 2014, Nicolaisen and Thorsen, 2013, and Takagi and Saito, 2015. Some special words about the research of Pikartova and colleagues, 2015, using several waves of ELSA. This research showed that stereotypes and expectations related to loneliness in old age were significantly associated with reported loneliness 8 years later. So those who expected that older adults are more at risk of loneliness, they themselves prove to be more lonely when they become older. Given the tendency towards decreasing levels of co-residence among older Japanese adults, Takagi and Saito investigated the changing role of not co-residing children. Their results indicated that meeting children in person, so face-to-face, was a better predictor of postponement of loneliness, while talking with the children on the phone was not. Well, interesting outcomes. I just are selecting some of these, but I think these longitudinal researches are really very helpful for our ideas about loneliness. And fourthly, a special set of longitudinal research nowadays is oriented towards investigating cohort differences over time. So comparing people who are between 65 and 69 in 1992, a new cohort of the same age group in 2002 and 2012. That's what's involved in the longitudinal aging study in Amsterdam, for example. Older adults of more recent cohorts showed increased social engagement in all forms of participation, including volunteer work, except for religious involvement. Research by Ayroeg and colleagues and Broeze van Groenau and Deeg. And research has shown that the relative strong feelings of loneliness among divorcees, compared with married people, have diminished over time. The main finding is that, compared with the year 1992, the divorces in 2002, same cohort, the divorces are less socially lonely, with a smaller and further decrease in loneliness reported in the year 2012, suggesting that the social position of divorcees have been improved over the last 2 decades. This is from research from Van Tilburg and colleagues, 2014. A factor that might be related to this development is central to the work by Suanet and colleagues, 2013, who showed, using data over a period of 17 years, that the saliency of non-kin relationships in the networks of younger cohorts, young old cohorts, is especially likely to have increased. So more non-kin relationships due to societal changes. Older adults born before 1922 are characterized by an age-related decline in the proportion of non-kin in their networks, while older adults born after 1922 showed a significant postponement of decline of non-kin in their networks. You understand what I mean, eh? Presumably, non-kin are more important in the lives of these younger cohorts than they used to be in older cohorts. That's an interesting outcome. Another special set of research, longitudinally investigating causal relationships, concerns research questions related to the association between loneliness and the risks of morbidity and mortality. That's what I mentioned as on the borderline with epidemiology. But in my opinion, this type of research is so crucial for us as social scientists that I like to continue to tell you something about this longitudinal research. And there are a lot of people involved in this kind of research. So Elward and colleagues 2015, Holwerda and colleagues 2012, Ijekovic 2011, Jaremka 2014. There is no pronunciation advice in these publications. I'm just trying to pronunciate what's that. Hopefully you can see you see the names of all these people on the slide. But two studies in this field are especially worth mentioning. These are the studies by Holt Loenstad and colleagues. The first one is from 2010 and the second one is from 2015. In the 2010 study, they investigated support exchanges in the social network and loneliness. And these two phenomena were then placed in relation to both morbidity and mortality by using a meta-analytic research design. In total, 148 large-scale surveys, of course, mostly originating from the United States and Western Europe, because there the longitudinal research is concentrated in these areas. In total, 148 surveys. They brought together with information about age and sex and support characteristics of the social network, loneliness, health status in the beginning and later on, and the cause of mortality. And they investigated the extent to which each of these factors influence the rate of mortality. This is a graph I prepared myself, but it's based on the Holt Loenstad publication of 2010. And what you see is the effects of different factors on mortality. So, air pollution is on the basis of it, at the basis. Air pollution has an effect on earlier mortality. Hypertension, BMI, physical activity, all of these, this doesn't work, but you understand it's going up, I'm going up, and what you see over there, smoking and drinking, here, are important factors affecting early, let me say, early mortality. But what's on top? Social support and loneliness. 50%, the data showed a 50% increase in likelihood of survival for participants with stronger social relationships, and the other way around. If you don't have good relationships, it's affecting early mortality. Why is this so important? These findings significantly show us the influence of not supportive social relationships and loneliness on the risk of death compared to the risk factors we know about smoking, alcohol consumption, etc., etc. But as far as policies are concerned, physicians, health professionals, educators and the media should now acknowledge that an unsatisfying set of social relationships and loneliness influence the health outcomes of adults, and these people should take social relationships as seriously as other risk factors that affect mortality. Since I know about this publication, I always use this graph. And since then, since 2010, the requests for lectures about loneliness in the medical sciences are increasing. They never were interested in social relationships, but now they are. And this is for me a crucial outcome of research. It is really very helpful because this is done by people from the medical sciences, and they trust these people. Okay, I come to the third theme, the country level differences in loneliness. Several scholars studied country level differences in loneliness. Jilha and Sarenheimo in 2010 formulated very nicely the why of this basic research. Although personal, loneliness is not a purely individual phenomenon, but embedded in given forms of social organization and cultural fabrics. That's why we need to address both individual and societal aspects of loneliness. The two researchers, Jilha and Sarenheimo, they compared firstly the frequency of loneliness across European countries. And I have to tell you, as an older person, I'm frequently asked to address the broader audience, volunteer groups of the Red Cross and of churches, etc., etc. And then I'm always asking them a question, so to make it interactive. And then I say, imagine a widow of 75 years living in Tuscany, and a 75-year-old widow living in the north of Finland. And then they think about Tuscany. We have this olive oil advertisements in the Netherlands. You maybe also, all the people sitting under a tree, and then the postman comes in and he is invited to join them for eating. And then Finland, and you think about these lovely red wooden houses in the snow. And then of course they say, and ask them, who has a higher risk of becoming lonely? And they all say, in Finland. It's not correct. Totally different mechanisms are making that people in the southern part of Europe are more at risk of loneliness. So that came also out of these researches. When you compare loneliness over the countries, loneliness is lowest in the northern countries and it increases to southern Europe. Poor health contributed to loneliness in all the countries, but there are several other factors associated with loneliness differences between the countries. In line with these conclusions, Young and Victor concluded, based on the European Social Survey, originating from 25 European countries, that the nation in which one lives has a great impact on reported levels of loneliness. Russia and Eastern European countries have the highest proportions of lonely people, about 10 to 35% for different age groups, and Northern European nations have the lowest, between 6%. Fokkema and colleagues, using data from the SHARE surveys, they try to elicit determinants of loneliness that might be associated with these differences between the countries. Older adults in Southern and Central European countries were generally lonelier than their peers in other European countries, and the research outcomes showed that this was largely attributable to demographic composition of the countries. In Eastern Europe, the percentage of widows among the older groups is much higher than in Western Europe. Another very important factor is the difference in levels of economic deprivation and related poor health. I myself did research in Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Russia. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the data, so I went to Georgia to visit with my colleagues over there what was going on. And then you see what economic deprivation in these countries means. Co-residing with the younger families, it's the older woman who has to do all the work. No heating in the houses, having to pour out the potatoes out of the soil themselves, being age 70 and over. Okay, so this is a real point of concern for future research. Having talked about economic deprivation, I have to mention in this context several researches that investigate this deprivation and the related broader social exclusion of groups of older people. There are many recent researches that can inform us about that. Scharf and Keating, 2012, Philipson and Scharf, that's an older one, 2004, and recently Walsh and colleagues. Countries and regions differ in explicit attention, explicit health and welfare programs for older adults in general and for special groups of elderly in particular. Minority ethnic groups, some groups with mental health problems, people living in rural areas, some groups with certain forms of disability who remain excluded from key services and benefits. I'm citing Philipson and Scharf. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that Walsh and colleagues brought together recently a group of people from many European countries to elaborate in a research and policy initiative to reduce this old age social exclusion. Reconsidering these research outcomes and expanding on a theoretical model that I formulated in 1987, my colleague Tesh Reumer from Berlin and I myself, we tried to formulate an integrated theoretical model combining both individual level indicators, determinants of loneliness and societal level elements. At the individual level, it's the quality of living conditions, level of social integration, etc. And at the societal level, we pay attention to the strengths of the societal welfare, the demographic composition, cultural norms and values. It's important to further do research to understand the puzzling reality about social integration and loneliness differences in these countries' comparative research. At the end of my summary, and in the context of this seminar, it's timely to cite the work by Durkheim, a very old publication that's important in this context. He did empirical research as one of the first in Europe, investigating the determinants of suicide in Europe. And the publication is from 1897. I think we have to be a little bit humble and not only look at the publications after 2000, but sometimes look back. No, I'm 77, so I'm allowed to do this. Durkheim emphasized the positive effects of individual level support and societal level social integration. He stated, and I cite him from the English publication that came from much later, of course, in 1934 or so. He stated that suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of the social group of which the individuals forms a part. The more weakened the groups to which an individual belongs, the more the individual, consequently, depends only on himself. He continued by writing, in a cohesive society is a constant interchange of ideas and feelings from all to each and each to all, a mutual moral support which supports the individual. And support is defined as the sentiments of sympathy and solidarity, drawing us towards others. I would like to honor Durkheim as a real forerunner in promoting theoretical models that combine both individual and societal level of determinants of social embeddedness and loneliness. And secondly, I think I have a minute, I also want to express my gratitude to the exploration work done by Helena Znaniecki-Lopata. She is well known in the United States, but I'm not quite sure if we know about her work, and that's why I'm telling something about her. She lived from 1925 to 2003. Lopata elaborated on the concept of social integration, and she was among the first to investigate social support systems. She wrote several books about that, 1979. Her work made it possible to better understand social support, both theoretically and empirically, with close attention to the social position, attitudes, and behaviors of those positively integrated and those lacking social integration. Lopata, of Polish background and later growing up in the United States, proved to be in an optimal position to investigate and distinguish the key points of social support, both in more traditional European societies, Eastern Europe, and the individualized American one. Her research into the position of older widows in the United States in a society characterized by nuclear family bonds is well known and was carried out in the mid-20th century. The transition from housewife and spouse to a woman living alone, the process of reformulating her personal status and identity, and the decisive role of the social support system in comforting her were central in Lopata's studies. She was among the first who recognized the many, many forms of loneliness with which older widows have coped. And she published this research starting in 1969. Her research outcomes are still relevant, in that she showed that older widows' loneliness is not easy to alleviate. Even if volunteers and professionals tried as best they could to help, in the end, only the personal support sources, so consisting of family and friend support convoys built up by the person herself over many years, proved to be effective in reducing widows' loneliness. Okay, in underlining the importance of loneliness prevention by building up and maintaining a reciprocal supportive convoy, I like to thank you for your attention.